December 17, 1944. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, Belgium. ***. The snow falls in silence, soft and indifferent, covering the broken bodies and shattered equipment scattered across the frozen earth. A German nurse, her Red Cross armband barely visible beneath layers of tattered wool, kneels beside a makeshift stretcher fashioned from pine branches and parachute silk. Her fingers, cracked and blackened by frostbite, tremble as they hover over the chest wound of an American soldier. She has not eaten in 3 days. The field hospital behind her is nothing more than a collapsed barn, its roof caved in from artillery fire, its walls offering no protection from the bitter wind that tears through the Belgian countryside. Around her, the groans of the wounded blend with the distant rumble of American guns advancing from the west. She knows what is coming. They all know. And yet, when the American medics arrive 2 hours later, pushing through the tree line with their Red Cross jeeps and their impossible quantities of supplies, the first thing they do, before treating their own men, before securing the perimeter, before even speaking, is kneel beside her and begin bandaging the German soldiers lying in the snow. She will remember this moment for the rest of her life. Not because it saved her, though it did. Not because it defied everything she had been taught about the enemy, though it did that too. But because in that single act of medical triage, in the methodical efficiency with which these American boys treated wounds without asking for names or uniforms or ideology, she witnessed the collapse of a worldview she had spent 6 years defending. The propaganda had promised her many things about the Americans, that they were weak, culturally degenerate, motivated only by money and materialism, incapable of sacrifice, unworthy of victory. But the propaganda had never prepared her for this, for the moment when the enemy would treat her patients before their own, would share morphine and sulfa powder and plasma without hesitation, would look at suffering and see only suffering, stripped of nationality and politics and war. This is a story about wounds, not merely the ones torn into flesh by shrapnel and bullets, but the deeper lacerations carved into belief itself. It is a story rarely told in the grand narratives of World War II, overshadowed by battles and strategies and the movements of armies across maps. But for thousands of German nurses who served on the collapsing fronts of 1944 and 1945, for the young women who had marched into war convinced of their nation's righteousness and their enemy's inferiority, the encounter with American medical doctrine would prove more devastating than any military defeat. Because wars are not won only with tanks and planes and superior firepower. They are won in the quiet moments when one side demonstrates a moral architecture so fundamentally different from the other that those witnessing it cannot help but question everything they have believed. The German nursing corps of the Second World War was not an accidental institution. It was engineered, carefully and deliberately, from the ideological machinery of National Socialism itself. By 1939, over 40,000 women had been recruited into medical service, nurses, surgical assistants, anesthesia technicians, each of them schooled not only in wound care and field surgery but in the racial theories and ideological frameworks that justified the war they served. The Reich's medical apparatus made no pretense of neutrality. Medicine, like everything else in the Nazi state, was a tool of the Volk, an instrument for strengthening the racial body of the German nation. These nurses were taught that their duty extended beyond healing. It encompassed selection, preservation of Aryan bloodlines, and the efficient management of resources in service to total war. They believed in what they were doing. This is essential to understand. These were not cynical opportunists or reluctant conscripts. Many came from educated, middle-class families. Many were motivated by genuine patriotism, by the desire to serve, by the conviction that Germany had been wronged by Versailles and was now reclaiming its rightful place in Europe. They had seen the newsreels of cheering crowds in Vienna and Prague. They had heard the speeches promising living space and security. They had been taught that the Americans, if they came at all, would be soft and disorganized, motivated by capitalist greed rather than true warrior spirit. The idea that such an enemy might possess a superior moral framework, a medical ethics rooted in universal human dignity rather than racial hierarchy, was literally inconceivable within the intellectual architecture of their training. And so when Germany's borders began to collapse in late 1944, when the Eastern and Western fronts contracted like closing fists around the Reich, these nurses found themselves retreating alongside shattered divisions, setting up field hospitals in barns and bombed-out schools and forest clearings, working with diminishing supplies and increasing desperation. By January 1945, the medical situation on the German side had become catastrophic. Morphine was reserved for officers. Anesthesia was a luxury. Sulfa drugs, the miracle antibiotics that had revolutionized wound treatment, were virtually non-existent. Nurses performed amputations with handsaws. They packed infected wounds with paper bandages. They watched young men die from injuries that, in any properly supplied hospital, would have been survivable. They had been told this was temporary, that new weapons were coming, that the Führer had secret strategies, that the Americans, when they finally arrived, would be dealt with decisively. But the nurses saw the truth in the faces of the wounded, in the steady westward flow of retreat, in the way officers no longer met their eyes when asked about supplies. The war was lost. And now they were simply trying to keep people alive long enough for the inevitable surrender. February 9, 1945. A field hospital outside Prum, Germany. The Americans arrived at dawn. Not with violence, as expected, but with a mechanical efficiency that seemed almost theatrical in its confidence. The German medical staff, 12 nurses, 3 doctors, perhaps 80 wounded soldiers, had spent the night preparing for capture, burning documents, hiding what few medical supplies remained, rehearsing in whispered German what they would say if interrogated. They had heard stories, contradictory and confused, about American treatment of prisoners. Some said the Americans shot medical personnel on sight. Others claimed they were sent to camps in England or America. No one knew what to believe. What happened instead would later be described by one nurse, Ilse Koch, no relation to the infamous commandant's wife, in testimony recorded by American psychological warfare units. The American medics entered the building with weapons drawn but lowered. They identified themselves in careful, practiced German, U.S. Army Medical Corps. "We are here to secure this facility and provide medical assistance." Then, before anyone could respond, before questions about surrender or interrogation, the American officer in charge walked directly to the nearest German soldier, a 19-year-old from Bavaria with both legs shattered by a mine, and began assessing his wounds. Not the American wounded. Not the priority cases determined by nationality. The nearest human being in medical distress. The principle guiding this action had a name, though the German nurses would not learn it until later: triage without prejudice. It was doctrine hammered into every American medical officer from their first day of training. Treat the wounded in order of medical urgency, not political allegiance. Save the life that can be saved, regardless of the uniform it wears. This was not mercy, exactly. It was something colder and in some ways more radical. It was the application of universal medical ethics to the chaos of war, a refusal to allow combat to override the fundamental obligation of a physician to treat suffering wherever it appeared. The German nurses watched, disbelieving, as the Americans unloaded supplies with a casual abundance that seemed obscene. Crates of morphine. Boxes of sulfa powder and penicillin, the new wonder drug most German medical personnel had only heard about. Plasma in quantities sufficient for 100 transfusions. Clean bandages, sterile instruments, ether and sodium pentothal for anesthesia. One nurse would later recall staring at a single American medical jeep and realizing it carried more usable supplies than her entire hospital had possessed in the previous month. But it was not the abundance alone that shattered understanding. It was the attitude accompanying it. The American medics worked with an almost bureaucratic indifference to nationality. A German soldier with a sucking chest wound received the same urgent attention as an American with similar injuries. A captured nurse with infected hands was given sulfa and fresh bandages without questions about her unit or her beliefs. The Americans did not gloat. They did not lecture. They simply worked, moving from patient to patient with the methodical efficiency of men who had performed these actions 1,000 times before and expected to perform them 1,000 times more. Ilse Koch, the nurse who would later testify about this moment, described a peculiar sensation that overcame her as she watched the Americans treat a Wehrmacht sergeant who had been part of an SS support unit. "I kept waiting," she said, "for them to stop, to ask him questions, to withhold treatment until he gave them information." This is what we had been told the Americans were like: materialistic, transactional, incapable of acting without calculating advantage. But they simply treated his wounds. And when they were finished, they moved to the next patient. It was as if the war, for them, stopped at the hospital door. As if there was some principle more important than victory that they were following. The principle had a history, of course, though few of the German nurses knew it. The Geneva Conventions. The Hague Regulations. The long, fitful development of international humanitarian law that sought to impose limits on the conduct of war. But more than treaties and regulations, there was something deeper at work. A philosophical tradition rooted in Enlightenment concepts of universal human rights, in the American founding documents that declared certain truths to be self-evident, in a cultural matrix that, however imperfectly realized, insisted that human dignity transcended national borders. The Americans were not perfect practitioners of these ideals. Their own history was stained with slavery and segregation and injustices that belied their founding rhetoric. But in the sphere of military medicine, in the specific domain of battlefield triage, they had institutionalized an ethical framework fundamentally incompatible with the racial hierarchies of National Socialism. The transformation did not happen all at once. Belief systems constructed over years do not collapse in a single afternoon. But cracks appeared, widening with each interaction, each small demonstration of a worldview that operated according to different rules. A nurse named Greta Hoffmann, 32 years old, veteran of field hospitals in Poland and France and Russia, found herself working alongside an American corpsman named Daniel Martinez. He was 24, from a place called New Mexico that Hoffmann had never heard of. His German was minimal, her English non-existent, but they developed a working communication through gestures and shared medical terminology. What struck Hoffmann was not Martinez's skill, though he was competent, but his attitude toward the wounded. He did not differentiate. A Wehrmacht soldier received the same careful bandaging as an American paratrooper. When Hoffmann asked him, through pantomime and broken phrases, why he treated the enemy with such care, Martinez responded with a phrase she would remember for decades: "They're not the enemy anymore. They're patients." This distinction, between soldier and patient, between combatant and wounded, was the razor's edge on which the entire ethical structure balanced. For the Americans, the transition from one category to the other was automatic and absolute. A man carrying a weapon was an enemy to be fought. The same man, disarmed and injured, was a patient to be healed. The categories did not blend or overlap. They were separate domains governed by separate rules, and the Americans moved between them with a mental flexibility that seemed, to their German counterparts, almost schizophrenic in its completeness. But for the German nurses, trained in a medical philosophy that emphasized racial hierarchy and resource conservation, this categorical separation was profoundly alien. They had been taught to triage based not only on medical need but on value to the war effort, on racial purity, on the abstract calculations of folkish utility. A wounded SS officer received priority over a conscripted Pole, not because his injuries were more severe, but because his life was deemed more valuable to the German nation. This was not hidden or shameful. It was explicit policy, defended with pseudoscientific rigor by the racial theorists who shaped medical education in the Reich. The American system rejected this framework entirely, and in doing so, it exposed the hollowness at the core of the ideology these nurses had served. March 3, 1945. American Field Hospital, Remagen Bridgehead. By early March, as the Americans consolidated their improbable crossing of the Rhine at Remagen, hundreds of German medical personnel had been captured and, in many cases, integrated into Allied medical facilities to help manage the flood of wounded from both sides. This was pragmatism born of necessity. There were simply not enough American medical staff to handle the casualties from the fierce German attempts to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge. But the integration had an unintended consequence. It forced sustained contact between medical professionals operating under radically different ethical frameworks. A German nurse named Elisabeth Meyer found herself assigned to a surgical ward where American doctors performed operations she had believed impossible under field conditions. The Americans had portable X-ray machines. They had blood typing kits and organized plasma supplies. They had specialized surgical teams, orthopedic specialists, neurosurgeons, anesthesiologists, flown in from rear-area hospitals to handle complex cases. The level of organization was staggering. But what troubled Meyer more than the material abundance was the wastefulness. The Americans used morphine freely, even on patients unlikely to survive. They expended plasma on Wehrmacht privates with multiple injuries. They performed lengthy surgeries on German prisoners when, by any rational calculation of wartime resources, those hours should have been spent on American soldiers who still had fighting to do. Meyer mentioned this to an American surgical nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Cohen, a Jewish woman from Brooklyn whose presence in the German medical staff's midst carried its own terrible irony. Cohen's response was patient, almost pedagogical. "We don't calculate the value of a life based on its utility. We treat the patient in front of us. That's the job." "But the morphine," Meyer insisted. "The supplies. You use them even on cases you know are hopeless." Cohen paused, considering her answer carefully. "Pain," she finally said, "is not more bearable just because someone is going to die. In fact, maybe it matters more to ease suffering when nothing else can be done. That's not waste. That's the whole point." This conversation, recorded in Cohen's personal diary and later archived at the Holocaust Museum, captures the philosophical chasm separating the two medical traditions. For the Americans, pain relief was inherently valuable, an end in itself, justified by the dignity of the suffering individual regardless of strategic outcomes. For the German medical establishment, shaped by 6 years of total war and the efficiency doctrines of the Nazi state, analgesia was a resource to be rationed, distributed according to hierarchies of value and utility. One system saw human dignity as inherent and inalienable. The other saw it as conditional, earned or lost based on racial and political criteria. The American approach was not born of naivety or unlimited resources. American military medicine in 1945 was itself a system of calculated priorities, of triage protocols and resource management. American doctors made hard decisions about who to treat first, about which casualties could wait and which required immediate intervention. Men died in American field hospitals because the scale of carnage overwhelmed even the most sophisticated medical systems. But the framework guiding those decisions was universal. Medical need, survivability, urgency, not racial hierarchy or political allegiance. An injured German soldier and an injured American soldier were assessed by the same criteria. This was revolutionary, not because it was always successful, but because it refused to encode ethnic nationalism into the fundamental logic of medical care. The symbol that haunted German nurses throughout their captivity was the simplicity of it all. The white canvas bags marked with red crosses, hanging from 4 stands, dripping plasma into the veins of Wehrmacht soldiers. Blood products, given freely to the enemy. The irony was crushing. Germany's medical research establishment had pioneered significant advances in transfusion medicine and blood storage during the 1930s. But the Nazi regime's obsession with racial purity had corrupted medical practice, introducing pseudo-scientific restrictions on blood use, prohibiting transfusions between Aryans and non-Aryans, hamstringing the efficient distribution of a life-saving resource for ideological reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. The Americans, meanwhile, had industrialized blood collection and plasma production on an unprecedented scale. By 1945, the American Red Cross was processing thousands of units of plasma weekly, shipping them to every theater of war, using them on American soldiers and enemy prisoners without distinction. The plasma bag, hanging from its stand, dripping its pale yellow contents into German veins, became for many captured nurses the physical manifestation of a different moral universe. Here was the enemy's blood, donated voluntarily by American civilians, processed in American factories, transported across oceans and continents, being used to save German lives. Not as propaganda, not as a calculated gesture, but as routine medical practice, the default assumption of a system that saw blood as a universal human resource rather than a carrier of racial essence. A nurse named Anna Richter, captured near Cologne in late March, would later write about watching an American medic hang plasma for a Waffen-SS corporal with a severed femoral artery. The corporal was 19, far too young to have participated in the worst atrocities but old enough to have been indoctrinated thoroughly in SS ideology. As the plasma flowed into his veins, as his blood pressure stabilized and the gray pallor lifted from his skin, Richter asked the American medic if he knew he was saving an SS man. The medic, a farm kid from Iowa named Thomas Brennan, shrugged. "I know he's bleeding out," Brennan said. "That's what I know." This radical simplification, reducing a human being to the medical facts of his body, stripping away nationality and ideology and history, was experienced by German medical personnel as both liberating and profoundly disorienting. It invalidated the complex hierarchies they had been taught to navigate, the elaborate calculus of racial value and political reliability. It suggested that medicine, at its core, could be something simpler and more universal than they had imagined. And in suggesting this, it called into question the entire edifice of justifications they had constructed for the war they had served. April 11, 1945. Buchenwald concentration camp, newly liberated. Not all encounters between German nurses and American medical personnel occurred in the neutral territory of field hospitals. Some happened in places where the moral reckoning could not be avoided or postponed. When the American Third Army liberated Buchenwald in mid-April, they brought with them medical teams to treat the thousands of survivors in desperate need of care. They also conscripted local German civilians, including medical professionals, to witness what had been done in their nation's name and to assist in the staggering humanitarian crisis. Among those conscripted was a nurse named Margret Schneider, who had worked in a civilian hospital in Weimar, less than 10 kilometers from Buchenwald. Schneider had known, vaguely, that the camp existed. She had seen the transports, had heard rumors, had chosen, like so many, not to inquire too deeply into matters that seemed beyond her control. Now she stood in a camp hospital barracks, surrounded by skeletal figures wrapped in blankets, watching American doctors and medics work with a desperate urgency to save people who had been systematically starved and tortured and worked to death. An American Army doctor, Captain Robert Goldman, himself Jewish, a fact that added another layer of significance, directed Schneider to help distribute food to survivors. But not just any food. Carefully calibrated refeeding rations designed to avoid refeeding syndrome, the potentially fatal metabolic crisis that could kill starvation victims if they ate too much too quickly. Goldman explained the protocol with clinical precision, and Schneider found herself following instructions mechanically, measuring small portions of broth and porridge, watching skeletal hands reach for sustenance with a hunger that was almost painful to witness. What shattered Schneider was not the condition of the prisoners, though that was horrific, but the realization of what it meant that the Americans knew how to treat them. These protocols for mass starvation, these careful medical procedures for refeeding the nearly dead, the Americans had these ready. They had prepared for this, which meant they had known or anticipated what they would find in these camps, which meant the rumors that Schneider had dismissed as enemy propaganda, the whispered stories about extermination and systematic murder, had been true all along, and the Americans had crossed an ocean to stop it. This was not the narrative Schneider had been given. She had been told that Germany was defending European civilization, that the war was about living space and national survival, that the camps were labor facilities for criminals and enemies of the state. The propaganda had never prepared her for the possibility that her nation might be the perpetrator of crimes so profound that enemies would travel thousands of miles to end them, that the Americans, dismissed as weak and decadent, might possess a moral clarity strong enough to mobilize an industrial democracy for a war of liberation. Goldman noticed Schneider's distress. He said something that she would recall with painful precision decades later. "You're a nurse. You understand saving lives. That's why we're here. Not for territory or revenge. Because this," he gestured at the barracks full of survivors, "this is what happens when medicine serves ideology instead of humanity. Remember that." By May 1945, as Germany surrendered and the full scope of the Holocaust became undeniable, thousands of German nurses found themselves in Allied custody, working in displaced persons camps and POW hospitals, processing the vast humanitarian catastrophe left in the wake of the Reich's collapse. The work was numbing in its scale, treating survivors of death camps, managing typhus and typhoid outbreaks in refugee populations, caring for wounded soldiers from a dozen armies. And through it all, they worked alongside American medical personnel who maintained, with almost mechanical consistency, the same ethical framework that had first shocked them in the Belgian snow 4 months earlier. The Americans treated everyone. They treated concentration camp survivors with a desperate tenderness. They treated German civilians injured in the final bombings and street battles. They treated SS prisoners and Wehrmacht conscripts and displaced persons from across occupied Europe. The medical care was not always adequate. The scale of need overwhelmed even the Americans' vast resources, but the principle remained constant. Medical need, not nationality or ideology, determined treatment priorities. Pain was pain. Wounds were wounds. Suffering demanded response regardless of the political history of the sufferer. For German nurses raised in a medical system where value was calculated and humanity was conditional, this universalism was transformative. Some resisted it, clinging to the ideological frameworks that had given meaning to their wartime service. But many others found in the American medical model something they had not expected, a coherent alternative philosophy, a way of practicing medicine that did not require elaborate racial theories or political justifications. You assessed injuries. You treated them according to established medical protocols. You moved to the next patient. The simplicity was almost theological in its purity. A woman named Frieda Bauer, who had served in field hospitals on the Eastern Front before being captured by American forces in Bavaria, spent 3 months working in a displaced persons camp outside Munich. She would later describe a moment in late June when she was helping treat a group of Jewish survivors from Dachau who had developed severe infections from their camp tattoos. An American medical officer, Major David Goldstein, was teaching her the proper technique for debriding infected tissue around the tattooed numbers. Goldstein worked with professional focus, explaining the procedure, demonstrating the angle of the scalpel, the depth of the cut necessary to remove necrotic tissue without causing unnecessary damage. Bauer asked him how he could do this, treat wounds inflicted by his own people's enemies, work alongside German nurses who had served the regime. Goldstein paused, considering the question with the same careful attention he brought to medical procedures. "I'm a doctor," he finally said. That's not conditional. It doesn't turn on or off depending on politics. These people need medical care. You have medical training. So we work together. After we've taken care of the infections and the wounds and the diseases, then maybe we can have larger conversations about responsibility and justice. But first, we heal. That's the sequence. Healing first, everything else after. This hierarchy, medical care preceding political judgment, was not moral relativism or naivety. It was a deliberate ethical architecture, a system that recognized the necessity of certain unconditional principles if civilization was to be rebuilt from the ruins of total war. The Americans understood that a stable peace required more than military victory. It required the reconstruction of shattered societies, the reintegration of populations traumatized and displaced by years of violence. And that reconstruction could only succeed if certain fundamental human needs, food, shelter, medical care, were met without ideological preconditions. The German nurses who worked in this post-war medical system absorbed its lessons slowly, unevenly, with varying degrees of acceptance and resistance. But the cumulative effect was undeniable. They had witnessed an alternative model of medical practice, one that took seriously the universal claims of human dignity that the Nazi regime had rejected. They had seen enemy soldiers risk their lives to save German wounded. They had watched Jewish doctors treat SS prisoners with professional detachment. They had experienced firsthand the moral power of a system that refused to encode hatred into the practice of healing. The plasma bag remained the enduring symbol. Years later, in interviews and memoirs and oral histories, former German nurses would return again and again to that image. The translucent bags of plasma hanging from 4 stands, dripping life into German veins. The symbol was potent because it was material and undeniable, a physical manifestation of abundance and generosity that could not be explained away by propaganda about decadent materialists or culturally inferior enemies. Here was the enemy's blood, freely given, industrially produced, universally available. Here was a medical system wealthy enough to treat its enemies, confident enough to expend resources on prisoners, morally coherent enough to insist that suffering demanded response regardless of nationality. The plasma came to represent something larger than blood products. It symbolized the industrial and moral capacity of American democracy, the ability to mobilize vast resources not just for destruction but for healing, to organize civilian blood donation campaigns on a national scale, to develop the refrigeration and logistics systems necessary to transport blood products across oceans, to institutionalize in military doctrine the principle that enemy wounded deserved medical care. This was the abundance that German propaganda had dismissed as weakness, the material prosperity that was supposed to indicate moral decadence. But the nurses who had lived through the war's final months, who had watched the Wehrmacht collapse from lack of fuel and ammunition and food while the Americans seemed to possess bottomless supplies of everything, understood that abundance was itself a kind of power. Not just the power to destroy, but the power to build and heal and sustain. And this abundance was coupled with a moral framework that rejected the racial hierarchies of National Socialism. The Americans were not perfect practitioners of their own ideals. This must be acknowledged. The same nation that preached universal human dignity maintained racial segregation at home, interned Japanese-American citizens, countenanced discrimination and injustice. But in the specific domain of military medicine, in the treatment of wounded prisoners and enemy civilians, the Americans had implemented a system that took seriously the universal implications of their founding documents. All men are created equal. Not all white men, not all Christians, not all Americans. All men. And if all men were created equal, then a wounded German soldier had the same claim on medical care as a wounded American soldier. The logic was simple, radical, and profoundly threatening to any ideology built on hierarchies of race or nation. Epilogue: The lesson learned in the snow. Decades after the war, an elderly woman named Ilse Koch, the nurse who had watched American medics treat German wounded first on that January morning in the Ardennes, gave an interview to an American historian researching the post-war experiences of German medical personnel. She was in her 80s by then, living in a small apartment in Hamburg, far removed from the chaos and trauma of 1945. The historian asked her what she remembered most vividly from her wartime service. "Koch did not hesitate. The moment they treated our wounded first," she said. "That's what I remember. Because it shouldn't have made sense. We were the enemy. We were losing. Our supplies were gone. Our army was defeated. Our ideology was collapsing. By every calculation of power and revenge, they should have let us suffer. But they didn't. They treated wounds. They gave morphine. They hung plasma bags for boys who had been shooting at them weeks earlier. And in doing that, they won a different kind of victory. They showed us that everything we had been taught about them was wrong. That kindness could be systematic, not just personal. That principles could be universal, not just tribal. That a nation could be powerful and wealthy and still treat its enemies with dignity." She paused, looking out the window of her apartment at the rebuilt city beyond. "You know what the hardest thing was? It wasn't admitting we had lost the war. It was admitting that they had been right. That their system, for all its flaws, was built on something truer than ours. That the abundance we had been taught to despise was actually the foundation for a more just society. That treating people with dignity regardless of their nationality or race or politics wasn't weakness, it was the only way to build something that could last. This was the wound that never fully healed, the recognition that the enemy had possessed not just superior firepower but superior principles. That the Americans had won not only because they had more tanks and planes and factories, but because they had institutionalized in their military doctrine and medical practice a moral framework that was, however imperfectly realized, more coherent and just than the racial hierarchies of National Socialism. The German nurses who worked alongside American medical personnel in the war's final months and its chaotic aftermath absorbed this lesson in countless small interactions. In the distribution of morphine, in the hanging of plasma bags, in the treatment of wounds without regard to uniform or ideology. Some resisted the lesson. Some never fully accepted it. But many others found in the American medical model a template for reconstruction, personal and national. If medicine could be practiced without racial hierarchies, if suffering could be treated as universal rather than conditional, if enemies could be transformed into patients through the simple act of removing their weapons and bandaging their wounds, then perhaps there was a way forward from the catastrophe Germany had brought upon itself and the world. The plasma bag, dripping its contents into German veins, became a symbol of this possibility. It represented not just blood products but the transfusion of ideas, the slow, painful process by which a defeated nation absorbed the principles of its conquerors. Not through force or propaganda, but through the quiet demonstration of an alternative moral framework in action. Through American medics kneeling in the snow to treat German wounded first. Through Jewish doctors treating SS prisoners with professional care. Through the systematic, bureaucratic, utterly undramatic implementation of the principle that human dignity transcends nationality and ideology and war. This was the paradox at the heart of the experience. The Americans won by treating their enemies as humans. They demonstrated power not through cruelty but through the systematic application of universal medical ethics. They showed that a nation could be wealthy and strong and victorious and still insist that suffering demanded response regardless of politics. And in doing so, they planted seeds of transformation that would grow slowly, unevenly, but irrevocably in the minds of those who witnessed it. The war ended in May 1945. The healing took longer. Perhaps it has never fully finished. But for the German nurses who watched American medics hang plasma bags for Wehrmacht soldiers in Belgian snow and Bavarian hospitals and displaced persons camps across a shattered Europe, the lesson was clear. Wounds can be treated or left to fester. The choice reveals what we believe about human worth and dignity and the possibility of building something better from the ruins of hatred. The Americans, in their imperfect and often contradictory way, chose to treat the wounds. And in that choice, they demonstrated a kind of power that no quantity of tanks or bombs could match, the power of principles systematically applied, of dignity universally recognized, of healing offered without condition or calculation. That was the wound from which Germany would slowly, painfully recover. Not the wound of military defeat, but the wound of moral recognition. The understanding that they had been wrong not just strategically but philosophically. That their enemies had possessed not just superior resources but superior ideas. That the future, if there was to be one, would have to be built on principles of universal human dignity rather than racial hierarchy and nationalist mythology. The plasma bag drips its contents. The wounds are bandaged. The work of healing continues. This is what victory looks like when it is built on principles rather than mere power, quiet, undramatic, systematic, and ultimately more transformative than any battlefield triumph. The German nurses learned this in the snow and the mud and the ruins of the Reich. Some learned it gladly. Others learned it reluctantly. But they learned it. And in learning it, they glimpsed the possibility of a different future, one where wounds were treated without asking first about ideology or nationality or race, where suffering was recognized as universal and demanding of universal response, where abundance was used not for domination but for healing. This is the story they rarely tell in the grand narratives of the war. But it is, perhaps, the one that mattered most in the long reconstruction that followed. Not the story of battles won or cities captured, but the story of principles demonstrated in the daily work of treating wounds and hanging plasma bags and insisting, through action more than words, that human dignity is unconditional and universal. The Americans brought this gift to the ruins of Germany, wrapped in white canvas marked with red crosses. And the German nurses who received it, who worked alongside the enemy and learned their methods and absorbed their principles, became the unlikely agents of transformation, carriers of ideas that would slowly reshape a defeated nation into something different, something that could not have been imagined in the dark triumphalism of 1940. They treated our wounds first. This was the testimony. This was the lesson. This was the beginning of understanding that wars are not won only with weapons but with the principles that guide their use and the vision of humanity that survives when the shooting stops. The plasma drips. The wounds heal. The work continues. This is what it means to win not just a war but the peace that follows, to demonstrate through systematic action that there is another way, a better way, a way built on the recognition that we are all, in the end, simply human beings who bleed and suffer and deserve care regardless of the uniforms we wear or the ideologies we once believed. The German nurses learned this in the snow. Some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to live up to that lesson. That, too, is a kind of victory, slower and quieter than battlefield triumph, but no less real and perhaps more enduring.